What is up everybody, welcome back to the channel, and in this video I'm going to be going over 4 more underrated cars in the street class I do think need another look. So starting off here with number 4 is going to be the TVR Griffith. Now, I personally haven't really driven this car all that much, I'm not going to lie on that, I really haven't touched this vehicle. Now there's also another version of this car that was in a Summit called the Peppermint Edition. I personally haven't found either one of these vehicles to be all that insanely different. Obviously, the Griffith is going to be rear-wheel drive. It's going to be a 6-speed. It's going to be an actual manual as well, so it's going to have a bit of a delay there when shifting it, which I personally don't think is going to affect this vehicle in a negative way. Now, when testing this car out, I did find the top speed of the Griffith to be around 245 miles an hour, so for that, it's going to be pretty dang competitive compared to many of the other street cars in the class. Not only that, it's also going to be a little bit faster than many of them as well, because I notice a lot of the cars tend to do around like 237 to like 240 or so, so at least this vehicle is going to have like a little bit more of a top speed to it. And from the testing I have done with the Griffith, I would say this car is going to have pretty dang good handling, and it also sounds pretty good as well because it is a V8. I do believe this vehicle is like one of the only V8s that they did do like this in Europe with this specific vehicle, and obviously this car is super sporty, and I would honestly love to see something like this in the US. This car is honestly really cool. I've always wanted to see one of these in real life, but obviously you'd have to import one of these over to the US there. But besides that, I'd say you really could not go wrong with the TVR if you wanted to race this vehicle around or have like a really good time with it, maybe grind out some events and go after like parts and followers. I think this car would do really well in those aspects. Now, if you really wanted to, could you race the TVR Griffith in like some of these summits and or PvP? I would say this car would do just fine in the summits if you really wanted to try it out. I might end up using some of these odd vehicles in the future as well, just to see how they might do compared to some of the better ones. We all know a lot of the summits and or like competitive events like that are probably going to be covered in like the Superleggera or the Porsche GT, so seeing a different vehicle in that can also compete is going to be pretty nice. Now sure, the TVR might not be as fast as those cars, but I do think it can compete pretty dang well. When driving this thing, I did find the handling of the car to be pretty decent for the most part. The car really didn't struggle all that much, and it was honestly going around the turns pretty nicely. Now, one thing I do want to talk about with the Griffith is the fact that this vehicle is obviously going to be a manual, so with this you'd obviously have to clutch in, which is going to give the car a bit of a delay when shifting, and you really can't do much about that compared to something like a dual clutch that you pretty much just hit like the paddle shifters, and the car will fly through the gears like that. So I would say that might be one of the only flaws about the TVR that I did notice when racing it around, but to be honest, from the races I did with it, I don't really think it's going to affect this car in a negative way at all. The way this car shifts is going to be pretty dang nice even if you guys are running manual. Even though the Griffith does have that delay when shifting the car, I really don't think that's going to affect this vehicle in a negative way at all. I still had a really good time racing this car in many of the events when testing it out, and I really do think if you wanted to, you could easily compete in summits with the TVR if you would like to. This car is definitely pretty decent. So if you guys are looking at something different to drive, or maybe you don't feel like driving the Superleggera anymore, I do recommend jumping into something like the TVR, because not only is this car pretty dang fast, and has a higher top speed of 245 miles an hour, it's also going to give you a bit of a challenge because this car will take a bit to get used to, but even then I still had a blast when using this vehicle. And now moving over to the third car on the list is going to be the Ferrari F40, which by the way guys, I do want to mention, this is obviously part 2 of the underrated vehicles in the street class. I will definitely be doing more of these videos in the future, so definitely stay tuned for that. But nonetheless, the reason why I added the Ferrari to number 3 on this list for me is because I had a really good time when running this car. Not only is this thing really fun to use, but it also has a very high and or competitive top speed compared to many of the other vehicles. The Ferraris also are going to be at 245 miles an hour, similar to the TVR, which I do think is kind of like a sweet spot for many of these vehicles because it gives them a chance to pass some of these slower cars in the street class, but also like, compete with some of the better ones that do over 250, because even then, I would say sometimes the handling of some of these street cars can definitely make a big difference on that. So the Ferrari F40 is probably one of those cars I feel like a lot of players probably do not use, including myself. I personally really only ran this vehicle before when doing like summits if I absolutely had to. Now I might end up using this car more in the future randomly because I find this thing to be that fun to use. But not only that, I really do love the sound of the F40. My goodness, the sound of the engine in this car is incredible. Plus, I feel like this car is also a work of art in a lot of ways, and I just love how this thing looks. So, one thing I also want to mention, by the way, guys, is the fact that the F40 is indeed going to be a 5-speed. So, if you guys are running manual, this car might take a bit to get used to how this thing might shift and or accelerate. But even then, I found the F40 to be weirdly fast, even with a 5-speed. I found this car flying out of corners and also accelerating pretty dang quick. And once you add the nitrous to that, I found this car to be an absolute blast in every way. So I also found the F40 to completely fly out of corners with really no issues at all, which is probably something you really wouldn't see all that much with one of the 5 speeds. I definitely recommend trying out the F40 if you guys have not. I don't know what made me go back to this car, but I also had someone comment saying take a look at the F40 once again, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm really glad I definitely did that because this car is a lot better than I thought it was going to be. And as I did mention before, with this vehicle having this 5-speed transmission, I think it's definitely going to be one of those more oddball vehicles you probably wouldn't really see anywhere, but can somehow keep up with many of the better street cars in the game, which I definitely would say the Ferrari is going to be underrated, at least until now. One of the biggest things I also noticed about the F40 was the way this car can handle around a lot of the corners. I was honestly not expecting it to do this good. When I originally started driving this car, I was kind of thinking it wasn't going to be all that great, which, as I did mention before, the only really reason I drove the car was to use it in summits and all that. Besides that, I really didn't race around in this vehicle. Now I find myself literally racing around the F40 and wanting to try this thing out in summits, which I will definitely do that in the near future once, some of the races are no restriction. I will start using cars like the F40 just to see how they might compare to some of the older vehicles and or some of the better cars in the street class like the TVR, for example. I definitely would say the F40 is going to have an edge over the TVR with the way this car handles, and for some odd reason I found the acceleration on this car to be a little bit better. Even though both of these vehicles have the same top speed, I would say they're definitely going to be underrated and deserve another look. And now moving over to the second car on the list is going to be the Ariel Atom. Now funnily enough, I really haven't driven this car much in the past either, and recently I've been finding myself having a really good time running the Ariel Atom, so I'm sure a lot of people know this, but this vehicle is going to probably be one of the best overall street cars in the game. That is honestly kind of slept on a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, I was not expecting the Ariel to be as good as it is, so I was wondering about this car for a bit, and in one of the summits I did see some of the top leaderboard people driving this car, so I was like, you know what? Let me try out this car because I really did not understand why so many players were running this one car on this race that was randomly no restriction. And funnily enough, the Ariel Atom honestly blew my mind with the way this car drives, and not only does the Ariel Atom handle really well, which I'll get into that more here in a second, it also has a really impressive top speed of 250 miles an hour, which is honestly really shocking to me. I was not expecting this car to be this fast, and it definitely puts it above some of the others that can do like 240 or maybe 237, and having something that can handle like the Ariel Atom is going to make this car insanely good. Having a higher top speed like that is going to make the Ariel Atom very versatile because not only could you run this thing on these smaller races because of its handling, you can also jump into the longer street events as well because this car can hit 250, which is definitely going to make it very good in a lot of ways. And what I found really funny about the Ariel is I was not expecting this car to be good, and I really do not see a lot of people running the Ariel Atom at all, which is kind of odd to me because the more I drive this vehicle, the more I get entertained by using it, and obviously in real life the Ariel Atom is honestly a monster. I do believe this car has a VTEC engine in it, and then you add in the fact that this car is also not going to weigh all that much, it's just going to make it incredibly good. So when it comes to the transmission on the Ariel Atom, this is going to be a 6-speed manual, so it will have that bit of a delay when shifting it similar to the TVR, and it's also going to have an extra gear compared to the Ferrari F40. I'm not gonna lie guys, I found the Ariel to be insanely good. I would honestly pick this vehicle over the TVR and the F40 if I had to. I feel like this car is going to be that good. For example, when I did jump into that one race in the Summit, I literally could not believe how good the Ariel was handling. Now, I've always known this car had pretty good handling, but I didn't realize it was like that good. So when I jumped into that one event, I literally could not believe the way this car was eating the corners. It literally feels like it's planted to the ground with no issues at all. Not only that, with this car being a 6-speed manual and having that delay, it still wasn't struggling with speed at all, even though it was having that delay when shifting the car, which is honestly something you probably wouldn't see with these vehicles all that often. I was honestly mind blown, and the fact that a lot of players probably wouldn't use the Ariel is kind of shocking to me. But then again, I was also one of those people that really did not want to use this car. I was not really into it all that much, and I was like, yeah, the Ariel's probably not that great. But honestly guys, I highly recommend trying out this car. You will not regret it. And not only that, this car is also really fun to use in first person mode because it looks pretty insane. And this car is probably going to be mind-blowing when going around corners, and I really did not think it was going to be that great. And even then, the stability, like coming out of corners and or going into them and keeping like a line straight on some of the faster areas at higher speeds, this car also shines tremendously in that aspect as well. So this is definitely one of those cars I highly recommend trying out. Not only does this car have incredible handling and stability, it's also going to have a very impressive top speed of 250 miles an hour, making the Aerial Atom very competitive. And now moving over to the number one car on this list for the part 2 of the underrated vehicles here, guys, is going to be the Porsche 911 Carrera 4S. So I'm not going to lie, not only am I a huge fan of Porsche in real life, but this car is going to be an absolute monster. And I really haven't seen many people talking about this vehicle at all. So we also have a very new Porsche here as well, which I do think is going to make this thing pretty awesome. I love the look of this car, but not only that, I would also say it's probably going to be one of the best street cars in the game that I really have not seen many players using, as I did mention before. I'm planning on using the Porsche way more often because I did not realize how good this car was. Not only is the handling going to be really impressive, which I'll get into that more here in a second as well, this car is going to have an insane top speed of 262 miles an hour, which is basically tying it with the Lamborghini Superleggera. So this car is definitely going to be very competitive in many ways, and I was honestly really surprised the fact that this vehicle could hit that high of a top speed. I was not expecting it to have almost the exact same top speed as like what is probably the best street car in the entire game. And if you throw in some good handling with that, I do think this car is going to be an absolute monster. One thing I also noticed about the Carrera is the fact that this vehicle is also an 8-speed, which might be a little bit different because you might find yourself shifting through the car a lot more often if you are running manual. But I personally don't really find this to be that much of an issue, and one good thing about this though is if you guys are running manual, you can try to find better gearing going around the turns and or maybe being in a higher gear that you couldn't have been with some of the other cars, which I do think is going to be pretty dang helpful. And that brings me into the next point of the Carrera, is going to be this car's handling, which I did find it to be really good. I was actually expecting that because I did run the Porsche back in the day for a little bit when I was messing around with this car, because I do find these to be really nice in real life. So I was like, you know what? Let's go drive around and do some races in the Porsche to really try this thing out. And I knew this car was going to have really good handling, and it definitely approved on that and or delivered with that as well. Not only that, the impressive high top speed of this vehicle is definitely going to make this thing really good. I did find this car to fly out of turns with a lot of power and or, being able to get to the turns with a lot of power is going to be pretty nice. Having nitrochemists on your vehicle is going to help with that because you could pretty much accelerate way faster, but also a lot more often as well, and you're not going through as much nitrous, so it's going to make this car very viable. You can also run the Porsche on these shorter street races as well and probably do very good. But not only that, with this car having that higher top speed, you can even jump on the longer street events and most likely pass and or stay ahead of most of the other street cars in this entire class because of that crazy high top speed. So I'm really interested in trying out this car more in the future and really testing it out, because I feel like this car does have a lot of potential, and I do highly recommend trying out the Porsche Carrera 4S if you guys have not. I personally have not driven this car all that much, but I will definitely find myself using it a lot more often. Even after running the Aerial Atom then jumping into this car, I can definitely see how there is probably a lot of good street cars out there that are probably not used all that often. I will definitely be taking a look at more of those in the future. Let me know in the comments below, by the way, guys, what are some cars you would like me to take a look at, because I do feel like there's a lot of underrated vehicles in every single class, which is kind of insane. But I will definitely be doing more on the street category in the near future, and I will also be taking a look at the other vehicle classes as well. But I highly recommend trying out the Porsche Carrera 4S if you guys have not. I feel like this car is going to become like a jack of all trades in the future, because not only can you do the longer street races because of that crazy top speed, but with the way this car can handle and the stability that it has, you can also do these shorter street races as well, making the Porsche a lot more fun to use and even a lot more viable, giving players something else to use besides the Porsche 911 GT and or the Superleggera. I personally find it really fun to really mix it up and try out other cars, and seeing other vehicles like the Porsche here or even the Aerial Atom being that good is definitely going to make the Crew 2 a lot more fun. But again, let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and out of the 4 cars, which one do you prefer to use the most? And thank you all so much for watching.